On paper, the car was flawless. Correct plates, correct stamps, correct route. On paper, the driver was flawless too. Right passport, right visa, right job. If you trusted paper, he was the safest man to cross the border that night. But the border guard in the booth didn't trust paper. He trusted the moment when someone's eyes didn't match their photograph. By midnight, the checkpoint was a stage built out of concrete and light. Floodlights carved a pool of white on the tarmac. Beyond it, the road dissolved into black forest and snow. Behind it, the low buildings of the post glowed yellow with stale smoke and old tea. The day shift's chaos was gone. No buses, no shouting traders, no crying children made to surrender toy guns at security. At night, there were only individual cars, one at a time. Each one a small private question. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Moravec liked nights. 15 years on this border had taught him something his training never mentioned. The dangerous ones often arrived when it was quiet. They didn't run the barrier. They didn't wave guns. They rolled up calmly, handed over perfect documents, and assumed everyone else would be too tired to notice the seam on the mask. The cold bit through his gloves when he palmed the metal bar of the barrier. Wind pushed thin lines of old snow along the asphalt like white snakes. He could hear the boiler in the admin building thudding. The distant murmur of a radio turned low so the political officer wouldn't complain. Nothing moved on the road. He could feel his own breath inside the booth. Then, somewhere out in the dark, an engine turned over. A pair of headlights cut through the trees and climbed toward the checkpoint. He didn't know yet why the sound made the hair on his neck rise. Later, in a warm office far away, when someone in a suit asked, "What first made you suspicious, Comrade Moravec?" he would not say, "Because my skin remembered things before my brain did." He would talk about timings and documents instead. People in those rooms preferred reasons they could write down. The car rolled into the light and became ordinary. A modest, dark sedan, clean but not ostentatious. Not rusted enough to be a local wreck, not shiny enough to be a party big shot. It stopped exactly at the white line. The engine died without needing a gesture from Pavel. That was the first detail. People who crossed because they has to, truckers, traders, waited for the guard's signal. People who crossed because they believed they had a right to be on both sides often moved a half-second ahead. The driver lowered his window in one smooth, practiced motion. Warm air breathed out, tobacco, wool, a sharp, clean note of decent aftershave. The man held out his passport already open to the photo page. "Good evening, comrade," he said, voice smooth enough for state radio. "Transit to the capital, documents ready." The smile was measured, polite, exactly as wide as it should be. Pavel took the passport. The cover was the right color. The emblem was crisp. Inside, the black and white photo showed a man in his early 40s, hair neat, jaw clean-shaven, expression serious in that particular way people adopt in front of official cameras. Name, Karol Novotny. Occupation, engineer. Place of work, State Industrial Design Institute, Capital. Multi-entry visa, official business, every box ticked, on paper. He lifted his eyes from the passport to the man in the car. The face matched. Same line of nose, same angle of jaw. Even the faint scar by the eyebrow, barely visible in the photo, was there under the floodlight if you knew to look for it. Most guards would have snapped the passport back, scribbled their stamp, and raised the barrier. Pavel didn't. Something was too aligned. "Purpose of travel?" he asked, though the visa already told him. "As written," Novotny replied easily. "Consultation on equipment with our colleagues across the border. Back in 3 days." He named the town and the factory like he'd rehearsed them. Frequent traveler? Pavel asked. Novotny smiled a little more, as if indulging a child. Regular enough to know your coffee is terrible, he said lightly. He tapped the corner of the windshield where an old foreign entry sticker clung to the glass. Same car, same papers, same boring engineer. Ask your system. Pavel glanced at his console. The passport number brought up a tidy history. Multiple crossings in the last 2 years. Always the same border. Always technical consultations. Annotations from other posts. Punctual, polite, no incidents. A border guard could read that and let the database do his thinking. Pavel read further. Dates, durations, patterns. 3 days out, 4 back in. Always the same route. Always the same declared destination. Last trip, delayed 1 day, due to weather on the foreign side. He remembered the snowstorm that had smothered the region then. The record was solid, and yet his fingers felt colder inside the gloves. Please step out of the vehicle, comrade engineer, he said. His voice stayed neutral. A request, not an accusation, for now. Novotny's eyebrows lifted a fraction. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed. Is there a problem? Routine, Pavel said. Random check. That was a lie they were both allowed to pretend to believe. Nothing at this border was ever truly random. Novotny sighed, just enough to signal that this was an annoyance beneath his status, then opened the door, boots on asphalt. He straightened his coat, stood in the floodlight, and for a moment looked exactly like every educated, cleared citizen in every poster about international industrial cooperation. Behind him, the dark trees watched. Pavel walked once around the car, letting his eyes and ears feel its shape. Tires, correct tread, no mud crust from side roads. Exhaust, ticking with normal heat. Bodywork, no odd panels, no sag. Trunk, closed. He didn't touch it yet. Open the trunk, please, he said. If there was a weapon, a panic, a bad decision, this was often where it started. The key turned. The trunk lid lifted. Inside, a medium suitcase, a metal tool case with foam inserts, a rolled blueprint tube. Spare tire, jack, rag, everything as you'd expect. He opened the suitcase. Clothes neatly folded, shirts, underwear, spare shoes. Nothing hidden in the lining. He unlatched the tool case. Inside, cushioned in cutouts, were calipers, gauges, a multimeter, wrenches. Real tools. Used, but well kept. He unrolled the blueprint tube. Machine diagrams spilled out in blue and white. Conveyors, housings, flanges, annotated with stamps and signatures. It was exactly what an engineer on official business would carry. That bothered him more than if it had been wrong. Bad forgeries were easy. Everything here was individual perfection. If there was a lie, it lived in the way the pieces fit together. You know this equipment well? He asked. Of course, Novotny said. I helped design half of it. And the factory? I've been there so often I could draw the courtyard with my eyes closed, he replied, a trace of pride in his tone. Most guards would have stopped there. Pavel didn't. Describe it, he said. The factory? Yes, Pavel answered. Security requirement. We've had forged documents before. People claiming to know places they've never seen. So, describe the factory you know so well. He let the challenge sit. Under the lights, the wind pushed at Novotny's coat. The engineer tucked his hands into his pockets, relaxed like a man humoring bureaucracy. All right, he said. He described the gate, the main building, red brick, 2 smokestacks, loading bays around the side, trucks queuing on busy days. It was good, too good, like a photograph turned into words. Real memory wandered. Real memory hesitated, doubled back, threw in useless detail, the muddy patch by the canteen, the dog that slept under the security hut, the terrible coffee. This description ran straight, like he was reading from the brochure the ministry might give visiting foreigners. Pavel turned one blueprint around. "Which hall do they use for this line?" he asked, tapping a section labeled Assembly. "Hall 3, Novotny said without pausing. "And where is Hall 3 from the main gate?" "Ahead and to the left." He was exactly right. Pavel knew that from an aerial photograph he'd once seen during training, a satellite shot that ordinary engineers never laid eyes on. Yet each correct answer only tightened the knot in his stomach. Everything he knew from paper, this man knew from... where? "Who is on night shift this week?" Pavel asked. The question landed soft, almost conversational. It changed everything. "Night shift?" "Yes," Pavel said. "You've been there often. You must know one of the foremen. We've had incidents lately. If we need to confirm something quickly with the factory, we like to know which foreman is likely to answer the phone." It sounded like a practical question. It was a trap only lived experience could spring. For the first time, Novotny's gaze slipped. Not far, just away and back, too fast. "They changed the schedule recently," he said. "I don't keep track of foreman rosters, comrade. I design machines. I don't drink with shift leaders." Plausible, too neat. Engineers who spent months in the same place always remembered at least one name: the man who shouted when the line stopped, the one who begged for a faster conveyor, the one who tried to fix things with a hammer. Pavel rolled the blueprints back into the tube slowly. He latched the tool case, closed the trunk, lowered the lid. The floodlight buzzed. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked once and was quiet. He made his decision. "Please come into the office for additional verification," he said. "Is that necessary?" The smoothness was cracking, just at the edges. "It's probably nothing," Pavel said, "but nothing is above my pay grade." "Come, comrade engineer, warm room, chair, bad tea." He let the tone be friendly. If Novotny was what he claimed, he'd be offended but compliant. If he wasn't, the walk to the office would show it. For half a second, Pavel saw the man's eyes flick past his shoulder, toward the dark beyond the barrier, the trees, the unlit stretch of road. It was the tiny, automatic calculation of distance any human animal made when it wondered whether to run. He didn't. He smiled instead. "Of course," he said. "Bad tea sounds dangerous, but I will survive." He locked the car, pocketed the keys, and followed where Pavel pointed. The office smelled like chalk dust, damp wool, and too many cigarettes. Maps covered one wall. Their side of the border in green, the other side in gray. Towns, roads, river crossings, arrows. Above them, the first secretary's portrait watched everything with painted, impatient eyes. Pavel sat his guest at the wooden table usually used for customs forms. He handed the passport and visa to the duty officer, Havelka, a man whose main talent was stamping things and avoiding decisions. "Extended check," Pavel said, "and call upstairs, line 3. Havelka's hand paused for just a heartbeat. Line 3 did not go to customs. Line 3 went 2 floors up, to a room whose door had no sign, where men in civilian jackets drew quiet lines on maps. "Is all this really necessary?" Novotny asked. He didn't sound worried. He sounded mildly insulted. Pavel met his eyes. "Probably not," he said. "And yet, here we are." He folded his hands on the table and watched. Not for sweat or wild eyes. Those belonged to smugglers, deserters, drunks. He watched for anger. More precisely, for controlled anger. The kind that came from someone unused to being challenged by people with less power on paper. Novotny didn't bang the table. He didn't threaten. He did something more subtle. He relaxed into the chair, deliberately. He adopted the posture of a man who remembered his importance. "Senior Lieutenant," he said softly, "I understand you have your duty, truly. But may I remind you that my travel is authorized at levels somewhat higher than this room?" He tilted his head up, not toward the portrait, but toward the ceiling, toward ministries, departments, the invisible weight of the capital. "There is equipment waiting," he went on, "schedules, foreign colleagues. If I arrive late because of an over-enthusiastic checkpoint, certain offices will be curious. And sometimes curiosity flows downhill." He didn't say, "You'll be in trouble." He didn't have to. The junior guard by the window shifted his weight. Pavel could feel the unspoken plea in the room. Don't make this our problem. Stamp him. Let him be someone else's headache if he's trouble. Trust the system. Trust the paper. He didn't trust either as much as he trusted the small, stubborn stone of unease in his gut. "Tell me about your son," he said. The question dropped into the room like a misplaced tool. Novotny blinked. "My son?" "Yes," Pavel said evenly. "You listed him on last year's exit form. Student at the Polytechnic. How is he?" He had read the old forms while the passport number ran through the terminal. Most people forgot what they'd told the state. Their lives blurred across the paperwork. The engineer looked down, then up. "He is well," he said. "Busy, exams." "Which year?" "Second," he replied, faster this time. "And your wife?" "Also well." "Her name?" Silence. 1 second, 2, 3. The clock on the wall ticked each one. Then, "You have all of that in your files, comrade," he said quietly. "You know my family, my address, my record. Why pretend you don't?" Because a man can forget what he wrote on a form, Pavel thought. He does not forget the name he says in his sleep. He didn't say it out loud. He tapped the passport instead. "I like to check that the person in front of me matches the person on paper," he said. "Paper can be forged. Memory is harder." For a heartbeat, the polite mask slipped. Something colder looked out through the same eyes. Not panic, not guilt. Calculation. Weighing distance, doors, numbers in the room. "Senior Lieutenant," he said at last, "I am due across the border by morning. Important people know that. If I am not, they will ask why. Sometimes that is not good for men who stand in small rooms and ask strange questions." In the corner, the junior guard stared at his boots. Nobody wanted to be the one whose name ended up in a complaint on some official's desk. The telephone on the wall rang. Havelka lifted the receiver, listened, covered the mouthpiece. "Line 3, he said. "They're ready." Pavel picked up the heavy black phone. Static hissed, then cleared. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. "Border post, report," it said. He straightened unconsciously. He gave his name, post number, time. He described the car, the papers, the behavior. He made his unease sound like data. Pattern of travel consistent with official duties, but verbal description of destination appears rehearsed. Subject avoids personal detail. Displays implied reliance on higher-level protection without naming specific officials. The voice asked 2 questions. Has he requested to contact any named superior? No. Any indication he knows we are involved? No, Pavel said. He thinks it is just me being thorough. There was a silence long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat crackling faintly on the line. When the voice came back, it was very clear. "Hold him," it said. "Do not let him cross. We are sending a car. Keep him calm. Do not escalate. Do not give him reason to believe he is of special interest." "How long?" "An hour," the voice said. "Perhaps less. Do not lose him." The line went dead. Pavel hung up gently and turned. Novotny watched his face. "Well?" he asked. "May I go?" Pavel smiled. The polite, empty smile he used for people whose fates were about to be decided 2 floors above his head. "I'm afraid there is a small administrative delay," he said. "Nothing serious, I'm sure. Please wait in the next room. There is a chair, and tea of a sort. Someone will speak with you shortly." The engineer's lips tightened just enough to show the first real crack, but he nodded. "Of course," he said. "Tea." He walked into the narrow waiting room with its 2 chairs and its optimistic map of friendly trading partners. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded more final than any lock. Later, in reports, the entry would look clean. Time, 01:12. Vehicle, sedan. Driver, Novotny, Karl. Status, held for verification. No line would mention the moment his eyes went flat when he couldn't produce his wife's name on command. No form would capture the half-second where he measured the distance to the dark road beyond the barrier. Paper would say only that a routine check resulted in a justified delay. But here, in the thin, humming air of the checkpoint, under lights too bright for the hour, it felt like something else entirely. The first move in a quiet duel between a man who had worn one name too many times and a border guard who had finally decided that perfect on paper was no longer enough to pass. By the time the border guard asked his wife's name, he knew the night had slipped off script. Not by much. Half a sentence. One question that wasn't supposed to be there. But, in his line of work, half a sentence could be the crack where a whole operation fell through. They called him Karl Novotny because the papers said so. The passport in his hand said so. The work ID in his wallet said so. The file on some clerk's shelf in a ministry office said so, in the tidy handwriting of a woman who had never met him. His real name was something he had learned to stop reacting to. Names were coats. You put them on when you crossed certain doors, took them off when you walked back out. If you wore the same coat too long, it began to smell like you. This coat had been worn before. Once, by the original Karl, a real engineer who had died suddenly of a real heart attack. Later, by others like him. People who needed a life with plausible travel, steady salary, and a reason to move across the border without setting off bells. Tonight, the coat was his. He knew the measurements. He just hoped nobody asked to see the lining. The crossing was supposed to be routine. That was the point. For 2 years, Engineer Novotny had been walking through this checkpoint like a man moving along grooves in a record. Same car, same route, same 3-day trips. Enough repetition to look boring. Enough variation in the dates to look human. On the foreign side, he was met, debriefed, redirected. Sometimes he carried papers. Sometimes he carried a face and a story, one he would hand, like a coat, to another man at a safe house. That other man would then wear the engineer across a different border, to a different town, to a factory that almost matched the one on the blueprints. The real machines were elsewhere. The real work was elsewhere. The paper life of Novotny was just a rail line they rode when they needed to move something delicate through a sector of Europe that preferred not to admit that such things moved there at all. For tonight's trip, the cargo was not in the trunk. The suitcase was exactly what it looked like. The tools were exactly what they looked like. The machine drawings in the tube matched a real conveyor system at a real factory. That was what made the lie strong. The lie was not in the props. It was in the purpose. He was not going to consult. He was going to carry the last part of a message chain that should never touch paper. Which courier route was safe? Which one was blown? Who would go where in the next 6 months disguised as whom? That and one other task. On his way back, if everything went according to plan, he would not be alone in the car. He would be bringing a man whose face did not match any passport to wear the coat for a while himself. But that was 3 days from now. First, he had to get out. He saw the border long before the lights saw him. He knew the rhythm of the place, the angles of the floodlights, the flicker of the barrier as it moved up and down, the way the booth lamp always seemed too yellow. He knew the faces less well. Guards came and went, but some remained. The one on duty tonight was one of the remainers. Broad shoulders under a worn greatcoat. Calm, watchful eyes. The sort of man who did not wave people through just to make his shift pass faster. In his mental file, the guard had a label: Moravec, Pavel, Border Post 14, Night Shift, Methodical. He had been told, methodical is better than bored. Methodical follows procedure. Procedure you can plan for. So he planned. As the car rolled into the light, he made himself yawn. He made himself think about coffee, about the song that had been on the radio an hour ago, about his son's imaginary exam schedule. He thought about the feeling of the wheel under his hands, the squeak in the clutch he'd been meaning to have someone look at. He filled his head with the same safe noise he used every time, details that belonged to this borrowed life. He had lived in it long enough that sometimes he woke up believing the details were truly his. That was the danger. If you forgot it was a coat, you forgot how fast someone else could be made to wear it. "Good evening, comrade," he said as the window slid down. He handed over the passport open to the photo, the way he always did. Transit to the capital. Documents ready. The guard took it without haste. His fingers were thick in the gloves, but the way he held the booklet was precise. Not careless, not clumsy. He watched the guard's eyes move. Cover, emblem, photo, data. There it was, the tiny check everyone did, even if they didn't know they did it. Does the face on the paper agree with the face in front of me? He knew the photo matched well. The specialists had done their work. The scar by the eyebrow had been added with care to his skin months ago. A small line, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. There to support the story, not to flaunt it. He smiled with the exact amount of politeness he'd been taught. Not familiar, not servile. "A frequent traveler?" the guard asked. "Regular enough to know your coffee is terrible," he said, allowing himself the rehearsed joke. That line had worked before. It made him an individual instead of a passport. Guards remembered men who joked about the coffee. People remembered you more when you gave them something to complain about. The trick was to be memorable in the right way. Annoying, not alarming. Human, not threatening. The guard's mouth moved in what might have been the ghost of a smile, but the eyes did not change. They were weighing, not reacting. He felt the first small chill of unease that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Please step out of the vehicle, comrade engineer," the guard said. Routine words, neutral tone. He had heard them before on this very patch of asphalt, sometimes because a nervous new conscript was watching, sometimes because random inspections had to remain random enough to look honest. He considered sighing with theatrical patience, then decided against extra acting. He opened the door, stepped into the light, and let the cold bite his face. He knew how he looked from the booth. Average height, average build, good but not extravagant coat. A man who had spent too many hours in design offices, not on factory floors. He had practiced that walk for months, the slightly soft gait of someone who sat more than he lifted. He stood by the trunk and waited. The guard walked around the car once, the way you did when you wanted to see if the machine matched the registration. Tires, exhaust, bodywork. He could feel the man listening as much as looking. Good, better, predictable. "Open the trunk, please," the guard said. He obeyed. The trunk lifted on its hinges. revealing the stage set he had checked twice in a garage the night before. Suitcase, tool case, blueprint tube, spare tire, jack, rag, nothing extra, nothing missing. The most dangerous thing in that trunk was the story that explained why it all belonged together. He let the guard open the suitcase. He let him thumb the shirts, lift a sock, find nothing. He let him open the metal case and see exactly what was on the inventory list filed at the ministry. Calipers, meters, gauges, all with serial numbers that would check if anyone bothered. He counted silently as the guard unrolled the blueprints. 1, 2, 3. On sheet 8, the man tapped a segment labeled Assembly Line 3. You know this equipment well?" he asked. They had drilled that question. "Yes," he said. "I helped design half of it." "Of course you did," his handler had said once, in a safe house across the river, sliding the fresh blueprints across a cheap table. "That way, when you lie, you'll be telling the truth about something." That had been the point of the long, tedious weeks at the real plant. Walking the halls, watching the machines, memorizing the layout until he could smell the oil in his sleep. He had been there. He had touched the conveyor belts, watched them shudder and jerk, listened to the foreman swear about parts. So why, when he said, "I could draw the courtyard with my eyes closed," did it sound wrong to his own ears? Maybe because he had said the line too many times. Maybe because the guard was listening too carefully. "Describe it," the guard said. That they had not drilled. Not like this. He did it anyway. Gate, brick, stacks, bays, trucks. He pictured the place in his mind and turned it into words, steady and straight. Vacuum-packed description. He heard it as the other man must be hearing it. Clean, confident, slightly too smooth. He should have thrown in the dog by the security hut. He should have mentioned the dent in the loading bay pillar. He didn't, because those details belonged to him, not to the file. And for the first time in a long time, the coat and the man wearing it were not perfectly aligned. "Which hall do they use for this line?" the guard asked, finger on the drawing. "Hall 3, he replied, no hesitation. "And where is Hall 3 from the main gate?" "Ahead and to the left." He was right. Of course he was right. Satellite photographs had been pinned to a wall in a windowless room, while men in other coats explained them. He had walked that courtyard, counted his steps from the gate to the hall. The answers were correct. Correct answers did not always equal safety. He could feel the guard's doubt growing stronger with each precise response. Perfection could be suspicious, too. There was still time to bend it. Make a small mistake. Laugh. Say, "Or is it ahead and to the right? I always get turned around." But Tradecraft slammed that impulse down. You did not contradict your own file. You did not muddy details the center had worked so hard to align. So he stayed inside the rails and watched them guide him toward a different destination than the one on the travel order. "Who is on night shift duty this week?" the guard asked casually. The words slid into his ears, wrong, like a note off key. This was not a question from the training scripts, not one of the usual probes. He had not been briefed with names. Not because the real engineer didn't have colleagues on night shift, he did, but because someone, somewhere, had decided that adding too many local human details to the coat increased the risk that the man wearing it would begin to care. Names were weight. You could trip over them. "They changed the schedule recently," he said. "I don't keep track of foreman rosters, comrade. I design machines. I don't drink with shift leaders." Half true. He had drunk with two. He remembered their jokes, their complaints about spare parts, the way one of them had talked about his daughter's exams. He remembered and pushed the memories down, into the place where his real life sat when he was busy being someone else. The guard closed the tube slowly. He could feel the man's decision taking shape in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way he looked at the car one last time before shutting the trunk. "Please come into the office for additional verification," he said. There it was, the fork in the road. For a heartbeat, his body wanted to run before his mind could scold it. He felt his eyes flick toward the dark beyond the floodlights. The night was too bright near the barrier, too empty beyond. He saw, in that glance, every stupid attempt he'd read about. Men bolting into the trees under searchlights, dogs on their heels, bullets cracking the air. There were procedures for emergencies. Not that kind. If this went truly bad, he had a capsule buried in a lining and a story that said he'd died of a heart attack like the man whose name he wore. That was the last layer. The one nobody talked about when they joked about industrial cooperation. He did not think he was there yet. You didn't spend years cultivating an identity to throw it away at the first extra question. So he smiled, thin, controlled. "Of course," he said, "I've nothing to hide." That was another lie they were both allowed to pretend to believe. The office was what he expected. Maps, cigarettes, portrait on the wall. He had seen versions of this room in 3 different countries. Only the faces in the portraits changed. He sat when told. He placed his hands on his knees, fingers relaxed. He watched the border guard hand his passport to the duty officer with the bored eyes and the stamping hand. "Extended check," the lieutenant said. "And call upstairs, line 3. Line 3. He knew what lines like that were for. He had spent enough nights on the other side of cables just like it, listening to men talk about interesting cases. He let his breath move slowly in and out of his chest. He examined the window with his peripheral vision, glass, too small to matter. The door, one, solid, a guard in front of it. No easy exits that didn't end in gunfire. So he did the one thing he could still control. He leaned back, deliberately. He adopted the posture of a man who knew he could make trouble for people in small rooms. "Senior Lieutenant," he said, voice dropping just enough to be confidential, "I appreciate diligence, truly. But my travel is authorized at levels somewhat above this building. If I arrive late, certain offices will be curious. I would not want their curiosity to land on a loyal border post for no good reason." He watched the junior guard flinch internally at the implied phrase, "no good reason." It was a card men like him always had to play. Protection from above was the best counterfeit armor in a brittle system. Most of the time it worked. The lieutenant didn't bite. He neither apologized nor picked a fight. He just watched, with the patience of someone who knew other ears were now pointed at this room. "Tell me about your son," the lieutenant said. For a second, the question didn't make sense. It was like someone had switched stations on the radio mid-song. "My son?" "Yes," the guard said. "You listed him on your prior exit forms, student at the Polytechnic. How is he?" In the back of his mind, a filing cabinet opened. Forms. Biographical details someone had assembled years ago by cutting and pasting from real lives. It was efficient to reuse existing families, efficient and dirty. Somewhere, the real engineer's real son existed. In some version of the universe, he might actually be a student at the Polytechnic. He did not know. He had never met the boy whose name had been stapled to his fake life. "He is well," he said. "Busy. Exams." It was the safest answer. Neutral. True of any student anywhere, most of the time. "Which year?" "Second," he said automatically, one layer deeper into the file. "And your wife?" "Also well." "Her name?" For a heartbeat, the room went very quiet. He saw the clerk's face at the ministry, the one from his first briefing, tapping a form and saying, "You don't need to memorize everything. The important parts will be in your file." He could picture the dossier, the page where wife had been filled in with a woman he would never meet. He could see the letters. They would come if he closed his eyes. They did. He saw them. He just could not make his tongue wrap around them as if they meant anything to him. Emotion and training collided in his throat. For the first time that night, he felt the borrowed life pinch. "You have all that in your files, comrade," he said, buying seconds. "You know my family, my address, my record. Why pretend you don't?" Because he wants to hear how it sounds when you say it, a colder part of him thought. Because he's looking for the gap between you and the coat. The lieutenant tapped the passport gently. "Paper can be forged," he said. "Memory is harder." For a flash, their eyes met without titles. Not guard and engineer. Hunter and man who had worn too many skins. He knew, in that moment, how this looked from the other side of the table. A man who knew every stamp, every route, every technical detail of a foreign factory, and could not, cleanly, speak his own wife's name. The phone rang. Old, heavy bell. The duty officer picked up. His eyes flicked once at the lieutenant. "Line 3, he said. Upstairs, in the nameless room, someone who had never smelled the cold at the barrier was about to decide how interesting Engineer Novotny really was. He listened without moving as the lieutenant reported. He caught phrases. Pattern of travel. Description appears rehearsed. Avoids personal details. Implied reliance on higher-level protection. Good ears, he thought. He had underestimated this one. He watched the lieutenant's face as he listened to the answer. There was no triumph, no fear, just a small settling, like a machine slotting into a different gear. "Hold him," the voice upstairs had said. He couldn't hear it, but he could read it in the set of the guard's mouth. The decision that rolled quietly down the cable had more weight than any barrier. Suddenly, the room felt smaller. The walls closer. The portrait heavier. "Well?" he asked, because that was what a man in his position was supposed to say. "May I go?" "I'm afraid there is a small administrative delay," the lieutenant said, with a smile that meant nothing. "Please wait in the next room. Someone will speak with you shortly." The next room. There was always a next room in stories that did not end well. He stood up. The chair scraped the floor. The junior guard studied his boots. He walked to the narrow waiting room and sat on one of the 2 chairs. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of a dropped curtain. On the wall, a map of friendly trading partners smiled in bright colors. He stared at it without seeing the borders. His mind clicked through contingencies. They knew something. Not everything. If they knew everything, he would already be in a different kind of room, with fewer chairs and no portrait. So, what had exposed him? He replayed the last 20 minutes the way his handlers had taught him to replay compromised meetings. Arrival, documents, trunk, tools, factory description, night shift question, son, wife. He could almost hear the lecture that would have followed if this debrief had been friendly instead of hostile. You let him drag you into the family details. You let the coat slip. You answered from file, not from gut. His gut had nothing to say about a wife that only existed in a folder. That was the problem with building identities out of other people's lives. They held up fine under stamps and signatures. They tore when you pulled at them with questions like, what is her name? How does she laugh? What does she do when she's angry? Questions that never made it into forms. Questions no one bothered to brief you on. Because in most offices, memory and emotion were considered weak links, not critical infrastructure. Here, tonight, they had been the tripwire. He had one safeguard left. In the heel of his left shoe, behind the rubber layer, was a small compartment. In the compartment, a sliver of glass and a crystallized escape that would turn his borrowed heart into a real failure in under a minute. It had been placed there by men who believed being captured with certain knowledge was worse than being buried without a name. This applied if, the training was clear, two conditions were met. 1. He was certain the other side knew who he truly worked for. 2. There was no realistic possibility of extraction. He was not sure of the first, and as long as he wasn't sure, he did nothing. He sat, he breathed, he planned. If the men from the unnamed office upstairs were good at their work, they would not open with accusations. They would open with doubt, bored questions, small inconsistencies. He could, if he was very lucky, bend the event back toward overzealous checkpoint. Blame the guard's suspicion on class resentments, on envy of people who travel. He could write a report in his head that said, "Encounter with conscientious but misguided border officer, resolved thanks to higher-level intervention." He could almost see the stamp. If he made one wrong move now, the report would never be written. About him, anyway, it might be written about someone else wearing this coat in a year. He found himself smiling suddenly, without humor. If they stripped the identity, the life would not be destroyed. It would be laundered, given to another man with the right face and the right scar. He was not the lie, he was just the one wearing it tonight. Footsteps approached, not the heavy stomp of boots. Lighter, faster, more confident. The door opened. Two men in civilian coats stepped in. They carried no visible weapons. They didn't need to. Their identification wallets were more dangerous than any pistol. "Comrade Novotny," the older one said, smiling politely. "Sorry for this unpleasantness. We had some questions about your file. We thought it best to ask you directly." He recognized the type. Internal security. The kind of men who thought in files and patterns, the way he thought in routes and covers. They sat, one in front of him, one to the side. It was almost comforting to be back in a configuration he understood, a briefing from the wrong side of the table. He adjusted his coat, breathed, smiled. "Of course," he said. "I am happy to clarify anything." It was only half a lie. He was about to clarify a great deal, one way or another. What they asked him, and what he answered, would fill long reports stamped with red and filed in cabinets that survived whole regimes. They would talk about his studies, his work, his supposed friendships. They would wait for his eyes to do the wrong thing at the mention of certain towns. They would see how his hands moved when they slid unrelated photographs across the table and said, "Have you ever met this man?" They would, at some point, mention his son and wife again, watching for the hairline fracture to widen. He would lie. They would lie. Between those lies, a shape would form, the outline of a man who had worn his coat so long he almost believed the name on the label, and the outline of a system that had trained border guards to look past paper and into the seams between official stories and real human reflexes. The duel had already started at the barrier. In the waiting room, it became a slower fight, his discipline versus their patience. In another building, on another night, on the other side of a different border, people like him had sat where the men in coats now sat. They had listened to captured couriers. They had drawn arrows on maps and said, "If only the guards had looked a little closer." Tonight a guard had. The cost of that curiosity would be calculated later. In units no one printed on money. Broken networks, blown routes, silent promotions, quiet burials. Years afterward, if anyone at that lonely crossing remembered the night at all, it would be as a story told over cigarettes. Remember the engineer they pulled in? The one who came through 100 times with perfect papers? Turned out he was someone else entirely, they say. Or several someone else's. Whatever had happened in the unnamed building afterward, whatever the final entry in the real report said, one line would remain true in both versions: that a man who was flawless on paper had been stopped by a question no file writer thought to rehearse. "Tell me about your son." Not because the answer mattered to any machine, but because of how long it took to arrive. That tiny pause had been the moment the coat slipped, and the man underneath, for the first time in years, had nothing ready to wear.